Welcome to part 14 of Vegas Pro Essentials. Let's talk animation. In some of the previous videos, we touched briefly on animation as we went through tools like Event Pan and Crop. However, there is a lot more you can achieve, and it's worth starting at the very beginning to get a firm grasp on animation. Here is a simple example. We have a talking head to a locked-off camera, and we'd like to zoom in to keep things interesting. The first step is to add your effect to the event. Click the Effects button on the event and add a picture-in-picture effect. The default setting of 0.5 is equivalent to 50% scale, so set the value to 1, which brings us back to where we started at 100% scale. Next, scroll the timeline cursor to where you'd like the animation to start. To animate the scale parameter, click the Animate button. To set a keyframe at the current frame, click the Add Keyframe at the bottom of the window. You can also enter a different value to the parameter, which creates and updates the keyframe. Move the timeline cursor 6 frames forward using the arrow keys, and double the scale of the media. This creates the second keyframe with a new value. Vegas Pro creates the scaling animation between the two keyframes, and you can review the animation by playing the timeline or scrubbing the frames. We also need to animate the position of the media so that the head is not cut off. Turn on Animate for the location parameter. Move the timeline cursor to the first scale keyframe and click Create New Keyframe. Next, go to the second scale keyframe and reposition the media in the video preview. Scrubbing or playing the timeline, you now have a fast zoom animation. We've got off to a great start, and animating parameters is fast. Taking this up a level, there are also controls for fine-tuning and tweaking the timing of the animation. This can be a strange concept at first, because we're not going to touch our two keyframes. We know where we want the image to be at these 2 points in time. We just want the movement between those two keyframes to be more dramatic. This can be done in 2 places. The first animation editor is located at the bottom of the Video Event Effects window. This has been around for many years and is a reliable tool. The second animation editor is a new tool and at the time of this recording is still in development. This one lets us change timings directly on the timeline. We'll first focus on the classic animation editor and then look at the new developing editor in a later example. Use the split bar to enlarge the current editor in the window. The animation editor shows the keyframe timings and their animation curves for the animated parameters. The top bar contains all the keyframes for the picture-in-picture animation. This is further broken down into individual keyframes for location and keyframes for scale. This means you can work all the keyframes at once or break it down per parameter. For instance, we want to adjust the timing of the animation. Start off by dragging a region to select the end keyframes. To slow the animation, increase the gap between the keyframes. And to speed up the animation, narrow the gap between the keyframes. Dragging the big diamond keyframes affects all the parameters in the effect, but adjusting the circle keyframes only affects the specific parameter. Another frequent adjustment is starting the animation sooner or later in the event. To do this, drag a region across all the keyframes and move the animation to start earlier or later. The other aspect of keyframing is fine-tuning the generated animation between the keyframes. You can see the small animation curves in the parameter lanes, and by right-clicking on the round keyframes, you can change whether the animation between the keyframes is linear, speeds up and down to give a more natural sense of acceleration or slowing, and so on. You'll also find the usual cut, copy, paste, and delete functions for keyframes. To have a slightly better view of the animation curves, switch from the lanes view to the curves view. All the curves functionality is the same. You select the parameter and you make your adjustments. Now I'd like to share a few tips to give you a better experience with this animation editor. Switch back to the lanes view. If your animation editor is not updating with the main timeline, enable the Sync Cursor to Media Timeline button. This ensures you're always looking at the correct frame in the video preview, and whichever frame you go to will be the same in the animation editor and the timeline. In fact, the animation editor is a mini timeline, so all the zooming and panning tools work the same. You position the cursor in the editor and use the middle mouse wheel to zoom in and out with a focus on the cursor. The scroll bar will zoom and pan the editor, and double-clicking the scroll bar will fit the entire curve to the view. The last animation editor tip is a big one. To illustrate this, I'll go to another event in the timeline where I've already added a picture-in-picture effect, but no animation. I'll move the timeline cursor to the middle of the shot and turn on Scale Animation at this frame. Looking at the animation editor, there is no keyframe under the timeline cursor, but there is a keyframe at the first frame of the event. This keyframe is always there, and you can't move or delete it. So if I set the scale value to 1 at the current frame, this automatically creates an animation between frame 1 and the current frame. If these two keyframes were the same value, then you won't see a change. But if they're different, you will land up with unwanted animation. The fastest way to resolve this is to right-click and copy your current keyframe, right-click on the first keyframe and paste the value. Since the value between the keyframes is the same, the animation curve is now flat, resulting in no animation. Normally this doesn't cause too many issues, but now you're aware of it. Let's move on to another example using the other animation editor. As I record this lesson, this tool is still in development. So to use it, go to the View menu and choose Show OFX Effect Envelopes. The shot in the timeline is two events layered together using video tracks. To save time, I've already applied some effects to the top event and keyframed a few of their parameters. Matching the previous examples, you can see the keyframes in the current animation editor. This is always available, but this time I'd like you to temporarily hide it by dragging down the split bar. Now, taking a closer look at the timeline track list, you will see a new button with two little arrows. This button is for displaying keyframes. Clicking it expands the keyframes for any events on this track. The keyframes for each event will always be visible, but placing the timeline cursor over an event will display all the event's effects in the track list. So if you don't see the event's effects, make sure the timeline cursor is over that specific event. With the keyframes displayed directly in the timeline, you can select the keyframes for a particular effect and drag them to adjust their timing. So the effect can be faster or slower by moving the keyframes. Currently, the same rule applies for the first keyframe at the first frame of the event. Even in this animation editor, you cannot move this keyframe. Now, if you need to access individual parameters and their animation envelopes or curves, there is another Expand Keyframe button for each effect. Clicking the first one will expand all the animated parameters of this effect. You can only display the envelopes of one effect at a time, so expanding another effect hides the envelopes of the first effect. What's great about these integrated envelopes is that you can expand the video track to make the envelopes larger and easier to work with. Looking in the video track list, you will see the separate animation channels for the effect, and the color of the Add Keyframe button matches the color of the corresponding envelope. With multiple animations in a single effect, the envelopes can get pretty crowded. To hide any specific envelope, toggle the eye icon. Now that you've isolated a specific parameter, you can go to the envelope and start adjusting keyframe timings and value. You can move the keyframe in any direction, but holding Shift will constrain the keyframe horizontally. This adjusts timing but not value. Holding Control only lets you move vertically, which adjusts the value and not the timing of the keyframe. All these changes will update live in the video preview wherever you've placed the timeline cursor. To add keyframes with this animation editor, double-click the envelope to add a point. You could also use the right-click menu or the Add Keyframe button in the track list. Deleting points or resetting the envelope are all done through the right-click menu. Finally, the right-click menu also lets you change the type of animation between keyframes. These operations are the same as the ones in the classic animation editor. Once you're done working with the envelopes, collapse the keyframes using the same buttons in the track list. As a reminder, we're still working on this animation editor, but it's worth learning this other method. If you run into any teething problems, please let us know about them in the OFX forums. Secondly, please be aware that older tools like Event Pan and Crop are not supported with the OFX envelopes. Please use the classic animation editor for those effects. In the next video, you'll learn how to import still images and integrate them as part of your edit. See you shortly.